Hello and welcome to Chapter 10. It's what you've been waiting for. It's all about IEPs, Individualized Educational Programs. So, the goal of the IEP is to provide a FAPE for students in special education. So remember when we talked about FAPE, we said the IEP is the blueprint. It's going to show how this student is going to receive a free, appropriate public education. It communicates how all the pieces will be carried out. The program they'll be following, their placement, any related services they may be getting, and how that will be evaluated. How will it show progress on those goals? So the IEP, remember, is so important that failure to create a complete program could render the student's complete special ed program invalid in the eyes of a court. So when there is litigation, a lot of times they're going to go straight to that IEP as that documentation of how things are being carried out within the school. So remember with FAPE and the Rowley case, we had kind of that two-part test, looking at procedural requirements and substantive requirements. So what we sometimes get most concerned about are all those procedures that we have to follow with the IEP, and that will probably be a lot of our time we'll spend with this presentation. But procedural requirements are going to include all those notices to parents, following timelines, making sure you're involving parents in all the decisions, making sure we have appropriate evaluations, getting all the correct people invited to the IEP meeting, and making sure all the components of the IEP are in place. And then, lastly, we need to ensure that that IEP is implemented as it was written and meant to be. There's a great resource that was listed in your text, and I also added it to our Unit 4 page as a bookmark. And it is a website created by the Center for Parent Resources and Information, which is an organization that's funded by the Office of Special Ed Programs, so that federal organization. And it's titled All About IEPs. It's really kind of a short, quick summary of all the pieces and really good for parents to go to kind of become familiar with the process, especially when it's their first IEP, that initial time they're going through everything. So it's a nice resource you can give to your parents to help them understand the process and feel part of that team rather than an outsider coming in with all of these professionals. So when we look at that IEP, since we began IEPs back in the mid-70s, problems have always existed. So, the list of those problems listed in our text include poorly trained teachers in writing IEPs, which I hope to help you become better IEP writers. Poorly developed team process. Like I mentioned before, when you have that solid team and good team that works together, it makes it so much easier. Number 3, paperwork problems and lack of time for teachers. This paperwork piece of being a special education teacher does take a lot of your time. And also to, dot your I's, cross your T's, and make sure everything is just right. It takes time, and often your own time, your personal time, which makes it difficult. Number 4, failure to link that assessment and evaluation with the intervention. We talked last time about how important that evaluation is and how it needs to be accurate and thorough so that you can create an effective program in your IEP. Sometimes there's minimal coordination of services with the general education teacher, so we have to work really hard to make sure things are carried out in that general classroom setting. Failure to develop measurable goals to track that achievement. We'll be talking about the 3 parts that need to be in each IEP goal so that you can make sure and ensure that progress is being made. Not allowing parents to make meaningful contribution to the team. We saw that in our critique in the case of Nicholas, where the parents weren't involved in any of that process. And then lastly, schools do not provide or fully implement the services written within that IEP. So you can see there's lots of places where we can have bumps in the road here when it comes to the IEP. So we want to make sure that we have a solid understanding of what is involved in writing that IEP and carrying it out. So we look at a quote from Bateman and Linden, written in 2012. A well-designed IEP can change a child's schooling experience from one of repeated failure, loss of self-esteem, and limited options to one of achievement, directions, and productivity. Now I want you to really remember that quote and think of that quote when you are in the thick of busy planning, lots of IEPs coming, lots of testing to do. Remember that you are essentially working to change a child's experience in school, and isn't that great, and isn't that what we want to do for all kids? Let's look at the purpose of the IEP. So we said it's the blueprint of their special education program. What is it doing? So number one, it is communication and collaboration. So it is that vehicle of communication between parents and the school. We want to make sure that parents feel like an equal part of the team. Not a bunch of professionals telling them what to do, but definitely having their input. Some parents are more willing to do this than others. Sometimes we have to work a little bit to have them speak up and contribute to meetings. And, some are just more reserved or don't have the capacity to make that contribution to the team very easily. So that's our job as case managers to kind of help build that relationship and get them to feel comfortable. It's also a time with the IEP that we can resolve those differences when we have different opinions on programming or time or goals. It's a team experience where we can work through those differences and hopefully come to a compromise. Number two, it's a management tool. So there's procedures set so that we can decide what services are needed to provide that student a free, appropriate public education. That's that IEP process. And then the IEP lists the services that are necessary. So that becomes the IEP document. So there's an IEP process following all those steps, and then the actual document. Number three, it holds us accountable. Remember, we need to really make sure that our goals are clearly written so that we are tracking the correct thing and showing that the student is making progress, or that there's a lack of progress and we need to make some modifications. Essentially in this IEP, the school is making a commitment to the parent and child that they are going to provide the students with the services that are listed in that IEP to carry out that special education program. It is a legal document, as we all know, so we really need to work hard to make sure we are holding ourselves and the student and parents accountable. Number four, it's a document for compliance and monitoring. This is where our State Department of Education can kind of monitor through looking at IEPs how special education programs are being carried out within the state. So these are those scary reviews when the team comes out to the school and we'll look at all your IEPs, we'll pick a couple and we'll sit down side by side and go through it with you. They really have been working to make this a less scary process, and they want to make it a more mentoring and helpful process. So try to keep that in mind if your school's up for review this year. Just remember, they're trying to help you and to help make sure that your program, special education programs, are doing what the law intended them to do. Lastly, it's an evaluation tool. Annual goals in the IEP are used to measure that student progress and is very important so that we are doing the best for the students. So we had the procedural and the substantive requirements. So let's dig into those procedural requirements. So we said that there's the IEP document and the IEP process. So let's look at that whole process and what procedures do we need to follow. So first of all, we're going to look at that pre-referral process. Gathering the data, is there a problem? Can we intervene? Or do we need to kind of go look into a special education evaluation? When it comes to IDEA requirements, there is no specific requirements set out for that referral process. So districts may develop their own procedures. And we've talked a little bit about how that might look within your district. But when it comes to the actual IEP process, when we go for that evaluation, that is where IDEA comes into effect. Okay, so you're going to start by obtaining the consent for that evaluation. We need to have written consent to evaluate, especially at that initial evaluation. And then remember that signature kind of initiates that timeline. So then we're going to evaluate and determine eligibility. So we want to make sure that those evaluations are sound. We have multiple people looking at the student. It's not only one test or one set of scores that make the determination. It's a team, multidisciplinary team. And then once we determine that eligibility after that good, sound testing, we're going to use the criteria outlined in IDEA to determine if the student has that disability, that first prong. Does the student have a diagnosed disability listed under IDEA? From there, we'll get consent from the parent again, and do they want special education if the student is eligible. At that initial phase, then we also need to get that initial consent for special education. Kind of a side note here, if you have a student that is moving from another state to South Dakota and you decide you need to retest to see if they're eligible in South Dakota, that would be considered an initial evaluation in our state, and you would need to get that permission for initial placement. Another tricky situation where it becomes initial placement is, say a student is developmental delay in early childhood. Now they're turning 6 and we need to retest, and we determine that they meet the criteria for a specific learning disability. Since this is the first time they are going to be identified as specific learning disability, then we need to treat that kind of as an initial evaluation, and we fill out that eligibility document. We need to say that this is the first time they are qualifying under SLD, so we need to fill in the boxes that correspond to initial evaluation. In that case, we don't have to sign the paperwork for initial placement, but it's just how you fill out that MDT or eligibility document. Okay, so then we've decided, the parents have agreed, and so now we work to develop that IEP. The actual IEP format is not dictated by IDEA like the form, but the states and schools have the right to create their own form that has the correct components in it, the required components. So states can come up with their own forms, they just have to meet the requirements of the procedure. So when you come to this meeting, a lot of times teachers like to be prepared and have the IEP written. You may do that, that is okay, as long as you present it as a draft IEP. So if you don't present it as a draft and just say this is the program we're presenting, then you could be getting into predetermination and deciding, making those decisions prior to the meeting. But if you have a draft there, it helps the ease of the meeting go a little faster, and you can gather input from the team members to make changes as you need. I find it very effective when teachers have that draft ready to go, and I think it communicates to the parents as well that, you know, we really care and took the time to make this individualized plan with to add your input now at the meeting. Sometimes I've sat in meetings where the teacher, the special education teacher, will just take notes on what people say, and then the goals aren't even written during the meeting, and so we're signing off on all of these things, but we don't really have the goals in place. They have good intentions, they want to save time in the meeting, but it really borders on not legal when you're not presenting those goals and everybody signing off on that they agree with that program or have that solid input. So, having that team in place in IDEA is to ensure that students with disabilities are understood and that IEP meets their needs. So you have experts in all different areas, including that parent being the best expert on their child in developing that program as a team. So then we go ahead and we, initiate those special education services and carry them out throughout that year before it's reviewed again. So those are kind of those procedural requirements, quick through that process. But let's look at who needs to be involved in that team, that IEP team. And a lot of times we kind of combine that MDT, the multidisciplinary team, eligibility along with writing the IEP. So it can kind of get confusing. What is the MDT? What is the IEP team? In my mind, in my experience, we usually do those together, and it's kind of the same team. So who are the required members? Who has to be there according to IDEA? There are 6 required members. So definitely number 1 are those parents. You cannot hold a meeting without the parents present, especially when it is that initial evaluation. It doesn't matter if the parents are there in person or if they are on the phone or virtually over Skype or something like that. We've done meetings like that several times when it's hard to get the parents to come in the school or they're uncomfortable coming to the school, don't seem to have the time. We do whatever we can to try to get them to be part of that process. We want them to have that equal partnership, and they have the right to that active participation throughout the process with that meaningful input. So really make them feel part of that team. Parents are involved through gathering consent. We also, when we go to planning meetings, we need to meet at a mutually agreed upon time and location. So that doesn't necessarily mean that we have to go with what time the parent can meet. There's parents that say, well, I'm sorry, I can only meet at 6 o'clock at night, or I can only meet at 9 o'clock at night. Try to reach a compromise. Can we get them on their lunch break, at work, on the phone? Make it so we can have a mutually agreed upon time. Work on that compromise. But the parents must attend, or you could be regarded as not providing a FAPE to students because they didn't have that meaningful input. Parents need to be given oral and written notice of that meeting time, location, and purpose. And, how much notice are we to give? It doesn't exactly say how much notice they need to be given, but the Office of Special Education Programs feels that 10 days notice is acceptable. So try to plan ahead, especially those parents that are hard to get into the school, or you're going to have to make more than one attempt. Make sure you're planning ahead so you don't run into timeline difficulties. And it's hard to kind of think ahead, but if you can write it out on your calendar and make those dates so you have plenty of time to meet those deadlines. What is a parent can be kind of tricky these days. If it's a divorced couple, the custodial parent is invited, and unless the parent's rights have been terminated, they are allowed to attend the meetings. If rights have been terminated, then we need to have the permission of the custodial parent in order for them to attend the meeting. Foster parents may act as parents under IDEA if that's allowable under state law, and you can. We also have surrogate parents, and that's when the parent cannot be located. Then there is someone who stands in as the parent and makes those decisions under IDEA. You can only meet without the parents if a reasonable number of attempts have been made, and that's during that reevaluation phase, not the initial evaluation. They must have that input and signature. And you know, what is that reasonable number of attempts? We kind of keep in our mind maybe 3 tries, and that should be pretty good as far as the law goes. Okay, so parents, important member of the team. So next, here was a little change in the revisions of IDEA in 1997. Prior to 1997, we only had to have a teacher at the meeting. So now in 1997, we required both a special education teacher and the general education teacher. So we need to have both members present. So it should be the special ed teacher who will be implementing the IEP, and that special education teacher often becomes the case manager. You kind of are in charge of the IEP and communicating that with other members of the team. In my case, often the special education teacher will run the meeting, but not always, especially if there's newer teachers that I work with. I'll offer to kind of lead the meeting and get them comfortable with the process, and then transition that over to them as they become more comfortable. So, always, ask your people on your team if you need help as you're starting out as a new teacher. I'm guessing your school psychologist would be, happy to kind of help you through that or help you prepare for that. It's important for us to have that general education teacher, at least one teacher, present at the meetings, because they are the experts in that general curriculum and can help us decide what accommodations might be best within the classroom to help them gain access to the curriculum, and a really important part of developing that IEP. Sometimes I feel the general education teacher feels kind of separate from the situation when they really should embrace this piece too, because sometimes students are, in a different room to get their services, and therefore it's kind of out of sight, out of mind. You might forget what you need to do while they're with you in the classroom. So really make that special education or the general education teacher feel part of the team too, and that you value their input and how you can help them best meet the students' needs when you aren't in the classroom helping, or the student is not with you. The next person is a representative of the school district. This is often the administrator or the special education director. This person needs to be qualified to provide and supervise the provision of special education and ensure the services in the IEP will be provided. With that goes being able to allocate those resources, allocate the funds to pay for the services. And they also are an expert in that general education curriculum and can give input there. So that is an important piece that is a required member. Next, we have a person who can interpret results. And this would be most important when there's been an evaluation. During your annual review, this person wouldn't be necessary because there aren't evaluation results to interpret. But this person, who's often the school psychologist, such as myself, ensures that the IEP process begins with an understanding of the student's individual needs as determined in the evaluation and how that might affect the student's instructional needs. It's kind of the base from where we build that IEP. Remember that IEP and those strengths and needs are going to create that baseline so that we can start to see progress. As a student becomes older, they can also participate in their IEP meeting as well. We start to look at requiring the student to participate when transition services are being discussed, so age 16. I think it's even great to start that process in middle school so that they can learn that they are advocates for their own learning and what they're comfortable with when it comes to accommodations and what works best for them. It's often hard for students to sit in a meeting such as that with all those professionals, but you as the special education teacher can really do a lot of prep with the student and mentoring them to be confident to speak up and share those things. I worked with one teacher who worked with kids that were working on life skills mostly, so those lower cognitive students, or students with lower cognitive abilities. And she really did a lot of work with them, and during their meetings they would have to introduce themselves and then introduce all the people at the table. And that was really neat because those are special people in that student's life, and that they could have that confidence to introduce them and really show how they become a team and work for the student. There's other team members that might be part of the team that are not necessarily required. We have the related service providers, your SLP, your OT, PT, social workers, counselor, and if they cannot be at the meeting, they can provide notes to be read if they cannot attend. So when a student is of transition age, then we need to start to invite a transition agency that might be providing services or paying for those services. Sometimes they're even over the phone. This would be an example. This might be your vocational rehabilitation counselor that should be assigned to your area, inviting them as transition is being talked about. And this is a great way for parents to learn services that will be available to the student or could be available to the student once they graduate and on into the work world. It might also be a program where kind of post high school, that 18 to 21, you can invite the program director of a program you're looking at sending the student for those years. It could also be the disability coordinator from college that the student is interested in. So there's lots of options of people to invite, but you must invite them when they become of transition age. And parents are free to invite anyone they want to the meeting. They do not have to get the permission of the school to bring someone to the meeting. However, if a school is going to invite an outside agency or such, then you must gain that permission from the parent. Okay, so that's looking at kind of our IEP team and who is required to be there. So, signing that IEP does not grant permission into special education unless it is included on your form. But really the signatures on that IEP document track meeting attendance. Who was there? Were the key players there? Were those required team members part of that meeting? So that's how they're going to know you're following that part of the law. There is a separate form in our state where you do that initial permission for special education. So you want to, generally in my experience, we do it all together in one meeting. We do eligibility, and then we create the IEP all in one meeting. Sometimes that doesn't work. If there's a very involved case, sometimes there's lots of evaluations to go through. It takes a lot of time to get that eligibility piece done. Then you might schedule a second separate meeting to develop that IEP. But we want to make sure that we're not delaying services. So if you're delaying services, then the student could be denied a FAPE, and we don't want to do that. There are some situations where it's allowable to delay those services, such as if the IEP takes place during summer vacation, or if other service circumstances which may cause a short delay. It might take you a little time to arrange transportation, especially when we're looking at early childhood, so it might take a little time to get those services in place. If we need to hire a paraprofessional, that could take a little bit of time. So those would be acceptable delays in services. Remember that IEP team is so important. Sometimes we get bogged down with the busyness and another meeting and another meeting, but we have to remember there is a purpose. Having that team was a system built into IDEA to ensure that students with disabilities are understood and that IEP is based on their unique needs. So those mandatory members are pertinent to develop that student's education. There are situations when we might need to excuse one of those team members, and we'll need to gain permission from parents to have one of those members excused. And in your place, you would give a written explanation of the evaluation. Now, sometimes if I'm unavailable to be at a meeting for whatever reason, a sick child or whatever, sometimes I will make the effort to call the parent ahead of time and go through my evaluation information so that they can hear that and understand that. Then I don't have someone else trying to do that might not be as familiar or comfortable with explaining my results. As people work with me longer, they kind of memorize my spiel and are able to do that and feel comfortable doing that. But I always give the teacher the choice in that situation. But that's just another way you can handle that. And just again, that we can use other technology to hold that meeting. Maybe the OT is between other schools and has other meetings. Maybe they just need to be on the phone and give their report and that way instead of driving miles in between. All right. They also really wanted to shorten up the number of meetings we're having as a reauthorizing IDEA. And so, when we're making changes or amendments to that IEP, rather than redoing the whole document, we can just do an amendment, a change to the IEP. We also don't have to have a formal meeting with that change. It's acceptable to make those changes over the phone, where the special education teacher, case manager, will call, visit with the parents to see if they're in agreement with the change that needs to take place, and then that amendment is added to the IEP. Okay, so what is this IEP? There are 8 components of the IEP which answer 4 questions. So the questions we're going to keep in mind when we're looking at the actual IEP: what are the students' unique educational needs that must be addressed in developing the IEP? We're going to find those from our evaluation, right? Number 2, what goals will enable a student to achieve meaningful educational benefit? Remember that from the Rowley case? So we're going to write those goals using that information from our assessment. Number 3, what services will be provided to address student needs and enable them to meet the goals? So how much time are they going to spend getting that special education? And 4, how will we monitor a student's progress to determine if his program is effective? And we've talked about that, making sure those goals are easily tracked. So it has the 8 components that are required. States and districts can add to the 8, but failure to include all 8 parts is a source of that frequent litigation. So let's get started. Number 1, we are looking at present levels of academic achievement and functional performance, which is one of those acronyms, PLAAFP, PLAF, as we call it. So here is where the purpose of it is to describe the problems that interfere with the student's education so that those annual goals can be developed. So here's where you're going to take that data you got in the evaluation and split out the student's strengths and areas of need from that evaluation. So you see here in this document, we have the area circled. So you list the area that they qualify. So let's say this student is a student with a specific learning disability in the area of basic reading. So here from page 78 in the IEP Technical Assistance Guide, we have the area of reading decoding. Then underneath that area that we're going to serve, we're going to list the student's strengths. And then below that, list the student's areas of need or weaknesses. Now the philosophy is that we're going to move those weaknesses up to be strengths through our program. We're hoping that those weaknesses become strengths over that year or 3-year process. Okay, so when we are developing those goals, we really need to see a direct relationship between what is listed on their present levels of performance and what is the goal. So we're looking at that weakness. Do we see a goal that's addressing those weaknesses to hopefully move them up to be strengths? So only goals are written for the needs that are addressed on this page. So let's say you have a student in their initial evaluation and you have tested all the academic achievement areas. You've done the 3 areas of reading, the 2 areas of math, listening comprehension, oral comprehension, written expression. So you've tested all those areas. Now, when it comes to eligibility, you found that the only area the student qualified in was the reading areas: basic reading, reading comprehension, and reading fluency. Those 3 are the only areas that you'll address in the present levels of performance. All the other academic areas will be listed in your report of the evaluation, but they are not included in the IEP because we are not servicing math. We are not servicing writing. You already spoke to those strengths and weaknesses in your skills-based report, not in the IEP. That makes sense. Kind of a thing to keep in mind here is those areas that aren't academic that we might need to address. If we have a student with a cognitive disability, we're going to need to address strengths and weaknesses in adaptive behavior. That often gets missed. For looking at behavior, we need to list behavior strengths and weaknesses if we're going to have a goal that is addressing behavior, especially those students under OHI with ADHD. If we have a student with autism, they need to have those behavior goals as well as emotional disturbance. So remember, all those academic and non-academic areas that we're addressing. Then next, how is the student's disability affects their involvement in the general curriculum for the skill area that they are qualifying in? Now here you need to be careful that you don't list their disability or but tell exactly what it looks like. How does their disability make it difficult for them to do the general education standards, and write that in there. If you go to that IEP Technical Assistance Guide, there are a ton of examples that one of those has to fit your situation. So go to that guide as you're starting out and maybe doing this for the first time. There's great tips there. Okay, so then the last area here, we're going to look at the present levels page. Again, we're seeing how important parents are. You must list parent-guardian input. One way I've seen in meetings, that's a good way to get this input rather than just saying parent agrees with everything we've said. If you ask the parent, what are your hopes and dreams, concerns about your child? And that's a good way to open it up and let them express, an open-ended question to express what those both concerns and strengths are that they see in the home environment. So again, when the state comes in to review, are they going to see, are the parents an active participant in this process? That's where they will look, that parent input on the IEP, the parent input on the consent for evaluation, the parent's signature, and so forth. So there is a case, Kirby versus Cabell County Board of Education in 2006, where the IEP did not include any present levels of performance statements. And listen to what the court says about this. This deficiency goes to the heart of the IEP. The child's level of academic achievement and functional performance is the foundation upon which the IEP must be built. Without a clear identification of a student's present levels, the IEP team cannot set measurable goals, evaluate the student's progress, and determine which educational-related services are needed. So again, each part of this process is so important, starting with that sound evaluation so that we can see what the needs really are. All right, so number 2 component. 2 and 3 kind of go together. So 2 being measurable annual goals and 3 being reporting requirements and measurement criteria. So from our needs page, or looking at the student's needs, now we need to address that through an annual goal. Keep in mind, what do we perceive that student can accomplish in 1 year's time from the time the IEP is written to a year later at that date? So not the school year, but the IEP year. There should be at least one good goal for each of the areas listed on the present levels page. So tie those areas of need to close that gap for that general curriculum, and look at how best you can match your goal to the grade level content standards. So I've attached also the link for the South Dakota content standards, so you have those for all the different areas. So it'd be good to, look at those for the grade level of the student and see how closely you can help them to meet that grade level standard. And then also we want to make sure that the goals are written clearly so that we can easily collect data to track progress within that 1 year and make sure that the students are getting a meaningful benefit from their program. If we aren't seeing that progress, we might need to modify that goal before that year's time is up. So in order to do this, we need to actually collect the data. So I know with my teachers and speech therapists this year, that is going to be my focus for them. Show me how you are collecting data to prove that your student is meeting or not meeting this goal. Also, show me the data to prove that this student is, in fact, in need of extended school year services. So really work hard to make those goals written clearly so that you can clearly track the progress. Or if the student would move and someone else gets that IEP, could they recreate that same program and collect the same data? So we have 3 parts to a goal. And again, look at that IEP Technical Assistance Guide, page 96. And it really spells it out for you. It gives you definitions. It also gives you tons of examples for different academic and non-academic areas. So first we must include a condition. Second, the performance. And 3, the criteria. So let's think of our student we said had difficulties with decoding. So the condition statement is going to tell under what condition does the student need to show this behavior. So in this sense, given a list of words containing R-controlled vowels. So this is what they're given. Now number 2, what's the behavior that we're going to observe? It has to be observable. You have to be able to see it, get something, show it. So here the student will decode the words. They're going to read the words. We can see that and we can hear that and get that information. So how well do we want them to do that? That's that criteria. So to get that mastery level, we want them to read that list of words with 85% accuracy. So that percentage. But then we want them to consistently do that, so we add in 4 out of 5 trials. So condition, performance or behavior, and that criteria. So if you think about how could you track that goal? So we have lists of words. I could see, making that percentage, and you could even, an older student could graph their progress. If you periodically, once a week, check on this goal, or every 2 weeks, and the student can really start to graph and see, are they close to meeting that goal? Do they have some more work to do? It could be a motivation and incentive to work harder at that goal. So that's what we need to include in those goals to meet those IDEA requirements. So the next slide shows what the goals page will look like on the actual IEP. So we also need to keep in mind that students who are qualified to take that alternative assessment, usually your students with the lower cognitive disability, you must not only write the annual goal, but you also need to write short-term objectives. It used to be that way for all students, but in the revisions they said this is only pertinent for those students taking that alternative assessment. Those lower functioning students need kind of the overall goal, and then these are the steps, the short-term objectives to help them meet that ultimate goal. So there you can see this page of the IEP has that goal with the short-term objectives underneath it. There is another page where it's just annual goals listed. Now we also have the requirement of how are we going to report these, the progress here. So that's number 3, reporting requirements and measurement criteria. So here we have the circle oval area there in different ways that we can get that product. So is it going to be a teacher-made test? Are we going to observe? A lot of times with behavior, that's what we're doing there. Are we going to have weekly tests, unit tests, student conferences, work samples, portfolios, oral tests, data response, or something other? So, circle whichever way you're going to gather that data. Then we need to report the students' progress on the IEP just as often as teachers report progress to students in general education. So think report card. So then we have codes on how we are going to track their progress. So we have P, which means progress is being made. I, insufficient progress is being made to meet the goal. X, not addressed this reporting period, might not be there yet. Or M, met the goal. So this is where your data is going to come in as important to give the correct progress code. We don't want to just guess or have a feeling about it, because if you're sitting in a courtroom, the judge isn't going to care one bit about your feeling that they've made progress. They're going to want to see the numbers, see the data that you've been keeping. So that is so important. Actually keep the data. And how often are you going to report to parents? Quarterly reports, trimester reports, whatever is done in your school you want to match. And then how are you going to report this to parents? Are you going to have conferences? Are you going to have a copy of the goals page? Are you going to have a report card? Is there another way you're going to report to parents? So we have the goals, but we also need to communicate to them how we're going to collect that data, how often are they going to find out about the progress, in what method are we going to communicate that. Okay, so now number 4, special education, related services, and supplementary aids and services. So we're going to have a description of the service, the amount of services, and the location of the services. So you can see a short little snippet down below. And this is, again, our same student we've been talking about with those decoding difficulties. So the description of the service is, we are servicing in the area of basic reading. Where is the student going to get that service? We said they are going to be pulled out to the resource room. And then duration for the length of the IEP. It's kind of your blanket response there. How many minutes? We're going to do 10 minutes a day. And how often? 3 days a week. So in a sense, they're getting 30 minutes a week for that reading instruction. So now if they qualified in reading comprehension, our next one would be reading comprehension. Resource room, length of the IEP, 20 minutes a day, 3 days a week. You list each and every service. And I would turn you to page 104 of the IEP Technical Assistance Guide for lots of examples on how to write in those services. The next slide shows what it looks like right in the IEP document. And you can see there with the boxes that you can type in that information. And there are listed below checkboxes that list out some of those related services that students may get. So you might not fill out any of that. If it's not pertinent, just leave it blank. Here's where you might write in a paraprofessional as being part of their program as well, or the service that they're getting. Transportation, those kind of things. All right, next, number 5 and 6. So 5 is the extent to which a student will not participate in the general education setting. And number 6 are the accommodations necessary to measure academic functional performance of the student on assessments or alternative assessment. So when we're talking about what extent the student participates with their peers, we're looking at that least restrictive environment, and we'll get more in depth with that with the next chapter. And when they are with their peers, what accommodations or modifications are needed for them to participate in that general education classroom? And when we're thinking about participation, we need to address both academic and non-academic participation. So this statement in the IEP must be very clear so the team knows exactly where the funds and resources are being spent. We want to consider, when we consider that least restrictive environment, we want students to be with their peers the maximum amount possible for both academic and non-academic settings. And we need to include modifications, if necessary, accommodations, and then that justification of placement. Why are we placing them where we are? And why not the more restricted environment, or why not the lesser restrictive environment? The next slide is taken from the IEP TA guide on page 101, which lists some accommodations and modifications. A lot of these pertain to testing, but give you some ideas on what you could put there. If you use some of those IEP programs, you might just have drop-down boxes that help you come up with things, but you can also add others as you feel necessary. The next slide is a slide that shows you how to calculate their time in special education. Now we want to make sure that we're only counting the amount of time the student is removed from his or her peers. That is calculated to determine the placement category. So if services are being given in the classroom where the student continues to be with their peers, that time is not counted as service time. If the paraprofessional is in the classroom with the student continues to be with their peers, that time is not counted as service time. It is only the time that they are removed from their peers. So we're also going to calculate that placement percentage according to a typical day, week, or whatever unit of time the team decides. So this method here calculates the placement percentage per week. When we're looking at things such as recess, lunch, art, music, PE, passing between classes, that is time spent with their typical peers, so it would not be counted. Okay. The next little paragraph just describes, like I said, with the special education staff or the paraprofessional works in that regular classroom environment, those minutes don't count as removal. But it's still important to document those services on that services page to show that they are getting those services, they just aren't being removed from their peers. So you can see there that you count the total number of minutes in their typical week so that all students receive. Then line B is counting the number of minutes they're removed for special education in a typical week. C, subtract the removal B from the total A to calculate the minutes in general education, and then divide the minutes in general education C from the total A to determine the percentage of time spent in the general education environment. So there's a little math for you. Okay, so that corresponds to the next slide, which shows the continuum of placement there. So you'll just match up the percentage you got using that formula and then deciding where they fit. So this is the percentage of time they are with their peers. So the bulk of kids are going to be that general classroom with modifications. That means 80 to 100% of their day they are with their peers. And then as you go down the list, that's where it becomes more restrictive and there's less time with their peers. You'll see the other side of that box looks at the early childhood continuum of placement, and that is it's a little bit different. And there are documents on the State Department of Education that really spell out what each of those codes mean for early childhood. Below there is the box of all the things that they would participate with their non-disabled peers, looking at all those non-academic things or specials, those kind of things, some extracurricular activities, and how that might look. I know a gal who is a sign language interpreter, and her services were needed in an extracurricular activity because the student who was deaf was playing football. So her interpretive services were needed during football practice to interpret what the coach was telling them. So that would be an example of, that extracurricular activity and how that might look. All right, so then comes the next box, the justification of placement. And let's go to the next slide. Again, there are several examples in that TA guide, pages 110 through 122. And if you're more specific to early childhood, that's on page 123. You're going to do this in an accept-reject format. So let's say the student is in with their peers less than 80%. So we will check the first box, the general classroom with modifications, 80 to 100% of the time as reject. And then you have to justify that. The student has not shown adequate progress in this setting. Student needs more structure and opportunities to have concepts retaught. So that's why we are rejecting that minimal pullout. So the next one is resource room. So they're with their peers 40 to 79% of the day. We're going to accept this placement and then give a justification why. The student needs a combination of large and small group instruction. The small group instruction is needed to reinforce concepts taught in a large group and provide student with opportunities to ask questions and get immediate feedback. So you accept and reject and justify. You also need to, address the harmful effects of the placement, which could include, being separated from their peers. There's always the threat of being bullied or made fun of if they're leaving the classroom. But just talk about why it's important that we're in that more restrictive environment if that applies. Number 7. Are we 7? I feel like my numbers are off here. Oh, yeah, we are at number 7. Okay, students' participation in state and district-wide assessments of student achievement. So this is where we need to decide as a team, is the student going to take the regular standardized assessments through the district? Will they take that with accommodations, or will they be taking the alternative assessment? I know, as a nation, we're really working to decrease the number of students that would be taking that alternative assessment, and hoping to get that down to 1% of the state's students taking that alternative exam, which is difficult. If they need it, then they need it. So you'll see the check boxes there and how you can address that. So the IEP doesn't determine if the student will take the assessments, but we're deciding how they will take the assessment. Everybody needs to take the assessment, unless the only decision we have is if they need it with accommodations or if they need the alternative assessment. The accommodation list includes those used for testing. So when you list out all the accommodations for the student, then we need to also think about what are they going to need for testing. And we need to use this on a regular basis, not just for the district-wide assessments, but thinking all assessments. Do they need, extra time? Do they need a read aloud? Directions given in a variety of ways, those kind of things. And those accommodations that you list must be in place, I believe it's 5 weeks prior to the assessment, so that the student is used to getting that accommodation. You can't just quick have a meeting and decide the student needs this accommodation because the test is coming up next week. It needs to be in place for a period of time prior to its use. Okay, now we have the next area, the projected date of initiation and anticipated duration of the IEP. This is just listed right on the front page of the IEP, and it's just a matter of calculating those dates. So the annual IEP meeting must be completed before the year is up. So let's say you wrote the IEP on September 30th. Then this IEP will expire on September 29th of the next year. So it is 365 days. So you have to have that annual IEP before September 30th of the next year. That gets a little confusing and tricky at times. And then your 3-year eligibility determination will be 3 years from that initial IEP date or that evaluation date. All right, lastly, we're looking at transition as that required component of the IEP. So the purpose of transition, which was added in 1990 because Congress felt they were concerned that many high school students in special education would either drop out or they would leave the school setting not prepared for adult life responsibilities. So this piece was added so that we can infuse a long-range perspective into the IEP process, looking beyond school, assist each student to make a meaningful transition from the school setting to the post-school setting, and help students better reach their potential as adults. Problems that have been encountered here is not addressing transition by age 16, not including the appropriate transition participants at the meeting, which we talked about, informing the parents about their role of proper transition services, or developing a transition plan that involved a coordinated set of activities to help the student meet post-secondary goals. This plan as well needs to be individualized, not just a cookie-cutter plan. In the 2004 revisions, a transition assessment was required. A lot of my schools use that ESTER as the evaluation tool, which is a checklist done by the teacher and the parent. to gather that information. And then another requirement that was added upon graduation or aging out at 21, they require a summary of performance to be written for each student to pass on to whatever their next stage of life may be. And this document includes their strengths, their needs, accommodations they've used, just kind of gives you a picture of the supports that they had while in school and how that you can make that transition to the workplace or whatever agency they go to after that to make that a little more smoothly. The next slide shows what transition planning looks like on the IEP. We also are listing the courses they need to take before they can graduate. We also are addressing with parents that when a student turns 18, they will be in charge of their IEP and signing and all of that unless the parents decide to get guardianship of the student. And we do that by their 17th birthday because if parents need to obtain guardianship, then that is kind of a legal, lengthy process as well. So you want to give them enough time to make that happen if need be. And then we look at projected graduation date or completion of the program, and then some of those other things that we just talked about. So it's all included there, and we also can address that within goals on the IEP. So another part of our IEP, we have special considerations. This is where we address, does behavior impede learning? Is the student limited English proficient? Do they need to use Braille? Are they deaf or hard of hearing? And need communication needs addressed. Kind of the mode of communication they're using and how their instruction will be communicated them with which mode of communication. And lastly, do they need any assistive technology devices and services? So sometimes for most students that can be a quick page. One thing that often gets confused is if I check yes, behavior impedes learning, do I have to have a goal, an annual goal that addresses behavior? The answer is no. You can say that yes, the behavior impedes learning and write strategies and interventions that are successful with the student in that box. You don't have to have a specific goal. The only time you have to have a goal when behavior impedes learning is one of those behavior-based disability categories. You know, OHI relating to ADHD or that emotional disturbance, autism. Those are the areas that you must have a behavior annual goal. But if you have a SLD IEP, you can just say interventions that are helpful with addressing those behaviors. And our last area here on the IEP is addressing extended school year. And a lot of times early on in the school year, we might check that it'll be determined by a date towards the end of the school year because you need to have that data to support the need for extended school year. So that concludes the procedural requirements. I told you that would be the bulk of our talk here. Excuse me. So now we also have those substantive requirements, and this is, you know, the Rowley case brought that two-part test in regards to FAPE, looking at the IEP for procedural and substantive requirements, and with some of those revisions that we were really required to look at that substantive requirement. But sometimes those lack of procedure can result in the student not getting that program to gain that meaningful educational benefit. So again, we want to ensure that parents are part of that participation and have input into all the steps across the process. This was in 1997. Congress felt they needed to really strengthen the role of the parent and have them feel part of the process. We also need to provide an interpreter if they need one, or if they speak a different language, or maybe their sign language. We need to provide an interpreter so that information can be communicated clearly. They can get a copy of the IEP. They can video record the meeting with consent, and but parents don't have the end-all say-all in the decision-making process of the IEP. It still is a team decision. Even though the parents are an important member, they are still also a member of the team. And that's why we have those due process requirements as well. We also look at communication requirements in implementing the IEP. Federal regulations require school district officials to ensure every student's IEP is accessible to each regular ed teacher, special ed teacher, related service provider, and other service providers who are responsible for the implementation. So teachers need to be informed of their specific responsibilities related to implementing the IEP. And, it's not a violation of FERPA laws to give that IEP to a teacher working with the student. They need to have that to carry it out. And then the last area we look at is placement in private schools. So if a public school places a student at a private school setting, the IEP remains the responsibility of the public school. The private school can take over those case manager types of duties, but whenever they meet, they need a representative from the public school at that meeting, since they'll be allocating funds and carrying out that IEP. When the school district is responsible for the IEP for the student at a private or parochial school, then the representative from the private school needs to be invited to the meeting. So a couple situations here. So sometimes our districts place kids at Children's Home Society, which would be a private school, and a lot of times the staff at Children's Home Society will take over that IEP and complete some of the testing or write the goals, but each time the school principal or teacher also attends that meeting, either if it's by phone or in person, to be a part of that team and knowing that the student will eventually transition back to the public school. In another district I work in, there is a Catholic school just right down the street, and the students from that school walk over to the public school to get their special education services. In this case, the public school special education staff are in charge of those IEPs and carry them out at the public school. So when they hold meetings at the public school, and then a administrator from the Catholic school will come be a part of that meeting. So that's kind of how that works. And to end this really long presentation, I apologize, we have lessons learned from litigation and legislation again. So first, involve a student's parents in the development of his or her IEP. 2, assemble an appropriate IEP team. 3, develop an educationally meaningful and legally sound IEP. Those 8 components. Number 4, ensure that all teachers and related service providers understand their responsibilities as listed in the student's IEP. And lastly, ensure that the IEP is implemented as written. And just a little humor on that last slide, your IEP prep and your IEP recovery. We all know that is pertinent sometimes, and sometimes more than other times. So that is a brief yet lengthy review of the IEP process and IEP document.